he had some psychological insight, and he knew exactly what he was saying to these victims. When he made these comments, and especially just prior to leaving, he made comments that I'm pretty sure he knew was going to instill fear in their lives for the rest of their lives. Just the kind of the stalking nature. I know where you live. I live
Right.
down the street. I could be the guy at the grocery store. And some of the victims, they did have issues with, seeing, specifically one victim saw a man wink at her at a grocery store, and they dropped the milk that they were holding because it just instilled instant fear in them. Because could that be the guy? It was sick in nature, for sure.
I am Anne-Marie Schubert, and this is Inside the Crime Files. Welcome to Inside Crime Files with Anne-Marie Schubert podcast. I am Anne-Marie Schubert, and this podcast takes listeners inside and behind the scenes of the investigation and prosecution of some of the most horrific and notorious criminal cases in California history. We also examine unique techniques, innovative ideas, and inspirational stories that come out of these cases. Today, we're going to talk about one of those cases, and that is what I call People versus John Doe, also known as People versus Mark Manteuffel. This case was perhaps one of Sacramento's most prolific serial rape cases in Sacramento history, an individual who eluded capture for nearly 3 decades. In this episode, we will focus on the innovative ways that we use to charge somebody using their DNA as a descriptor, as well as the use of genetic genealogy to ultimately identify and capture this rapist. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Assistant Chief Deputy Amy Holliday, Sacramento Sheriff's Office retired cold case investigator Micki Links, and Sacramento Police Department Detective Shaun McGovern. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. And if I can just start off, maybe I'll start with Amy. If you can just tell us a little bit about yourself and what your assignment is.
Sure. Good morning. My name is Amy Holliday. I'm an Assistant Chief Deputy with the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office. I've been a prosecutor for 20 years as of yesterday. And I've worked a lot of different types of cases, everything from misdemeanors to homicides. But my passion is the prosecution of sexual assaults and homicides.
Great. Thanks so much, Amy. Micki, I'll turn it over to you. How about you?
Good morning. I'm Micki Links. I am retired sergeant with the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department. I came back right after retirement and volunteer my time working homicide and sexual assault cold cases. So I've been working almost 37 years now. And I have a passion for these cases, and I just love that we're starting to solve them the way we are now.
Excellent. Thanks, Micki. And Shaun, how about you?
My name is Shaun McGovern. I'm a detective with the Sacramento Police Department. I'm currently assigned to the homicide unit, but at the time of this investigation, I was working with the sex assault unit. And I truly am passionate about complex cases, and specifically sex assault cases are one of my passionate investigative passions that I have for working in law enforcement. So I was truly honored to be a part of this investigation.
Great. Thanks so much, Shaun. So let's start off, first of all, just kind of talking about the crime spree that this case involved. And I'm going to start with Micki, first of all, because I think the first one that we know of occurred in 1992. And for the listeners, I want to just make sure folks understand that we're only going to refer to the victims by their first name out of their privacy and protecting their privacy. So Micki, if you can start with the 1992 case that happened in the sheriff's jurisdiction.
Yes, so May 5th of 1992, so next month we're looking at 30 years ago. Our victim, Luetta, who was 52 years old at the time, arrived home from work. Her home was in Rancho Cordova. She arrived home, drove into the garage, closed the garage. She was a little late. She had a meeting that evening, so she was actually getting home about 8:30. Excuse me. She unlocked the door from the garage into the kitchen, locked it as soon as she got into the house, Louetta had an alarm system on her house. She went to the keypad, entered the alarm code to disable the alarm. She walked around the house. It was warm. She started opening windows and sliding doors. As she walked down the hallway to her master bedroom, she was confronted by a masked man wearing gloves. He had a ski mask on, covering his face, although she could see that the eye holes and the mouth, and she could tell right away that it was a white male that was in her hallway. He immediately hit her several times in the head, knocked her down, ends up tying her feet and arms together. She sustained a pretty significant injury on her head from him hitting her. And over the next few hours, he repeatedly sexually assaulted her. He took her into her bedroom. He actually tied her legs to the bed. He would leave her for a little while, rummage through the house, looking for things. He would come back, sexually assault her again. I should say that he actually had taped her eyes and her mouth using some kind of clear duct tape, and then actually put a pillowcase over her head. This went on for several hours. He threatened to kill her. He told her that he lived nearby and would watch her so that if she called the cops, he would know that and he would come back and kill her. She told him she just wanted to call her daughter. He eventually left. We think he went out one of the doors. And at this point, even now, it's unclear how he got into the house because the alarm had been set. Although when crime scene investigators were there originally, it did look like maybe he made entry through the attic, through an air conditioning unit up on the roof of the house. So Louetta called her daughter after she was sure that he was gone. She hadn't heard from him for about 10 minutes. He had actually moved the ties in front of her so she could let herself go after he was gone. So she called her daughter, and then they in turn called the police.
So before I go to the Sac PD case, Micki, 37 years in this business, is it a fair statement that these types of home invasion, stranger rapes are very rare?
Well, it's kind of funny you say that because they seem to be rare, and especially nowadays. But back then in the 90s, actually, we had the other series, the Second Story Rapist.
Right.
And I worked patrol during that time and was the first responder on a lot of those cases.
Right.
So we did have, back in that time frame, we did have quite a few series going on, and they were stranger, break in the house, sexually assault, and injure these victims.
Right. So Shaun, let's talk about the incident that happened a few years later in March of 94. We had another case, another stranger rape that was within Sac PD's jurisdiction. So maybe you can kind of walk the listeners through that.
So in March 23rd of 1994, victim Jerry, she was living by Sac State. She was employed with Sacramento State University and was within walking distance of the university because it was truly one of her loves was the university and the students there. So she had attended a meeting, like a conference downtown, and arrived home late in the evening at about 9 p.m. It was kind of out of her norm, so getting home later, but she had a garage that was towards the back of her property and it was detached. So she always entered her house through a rear sliding glass door. When she arrived home, she desperately had to use the restroom, and so she kind of rushed to get in, and in the middle of rushing through, she realized that the slider was broken and it wasn't sliding properly. And so she went through her back living room area, and once she rounded the corner, she saw a male subject wearing a dark ski mask, and as soon as she saw the subject, she was startled and attempted to talk to the person, and immediately she was barraged with strikes to her head. She was thrown up against the hallway wall, which had a picture frame on the wall. She shattered the glass in the picture frame. Ultimately, she ended up getting in this barrage of hits, she ended up with a skull fracture. And so she was dazed and said she was feeling like she was seeing stars and she was about to go unconscious. She put up a fight, and ultimately he took her down to the ground and was yelling at her, giving her commands to stop fighting, which comes into play later on in our investigation. But he kind of gives her commands to stop fighting him, and then ultimately he had prior to the attack, he had cut and prepared electrical cords to bind her feet and her wrists. And so he ended up taking her into the front living room where he bound her, he finished binding her wrists and ankles, and proceeded to sexually assault her there in the front room. From there, he walked around again, similar to the Luetta case. He walked around the house, rummaging through items, and kind of just did whatever he wanted in her house while she was laying in the front. He ultimately moved her to the bedroom, where he bound her to the bed, and sexually assaulted her there again. From there, he ended up going to the bathroom and turning on the faucet in the bathtub, and Jerry could hear the bathtub being filled. And in her mind, she told me she made herself right for dying, because she thought that the next thing he was going to do was going to kill her in the bathtub. He moved her to the bathtub and made her wash, which was interesting, especially for the 90s. He had some forethought into trying to erase evidence by having her wash and remove her clothing. He cut her clothing off, so she was naked, and made her wash up. He then, similar to the Luetta case, he put the bindings of her hands in front of her and asked her if she could get out if he left her after a period of time. He made similar threats that he knew who she was and where she lived, and that he would come back. And so after that, Jerry could hear him leave out the front door. She waited a period of time to make sure that he had left, and she was able to get out of her bindings. She grabbed a bath towel and then ran to her garage to get into her car. She drove frantically to a friend's house a couple blocks down the street, parked the car in the middle of the lawn. She was struggling with her head injury too. Now, mind you, she fled in like a panic because she didn't know if he was coming back, but her only means of getting away was driving. And so she was trying to drive with a major head injury, and she ultimately got to her friend's house and told them what had occurred. And that's when they called 911, and officers responded to assist her in clearing the house and making sure everybody was safe.
You mentioned kind of the forethought that this person had in terms of really kind of hiding evidence. And, for the listeners, we're talking about the early 90s. This is kind of really before DNA became something that people knew about, right? But I think it plays in later when we get to who the person is in terms of his efforts to elude capture.
Definitely, he had some law enforcement knowledge. He had some. I think it also plays into the language that he used when he was assaulting her in the hallway. It's interesting because you hear her statement, and then later we find out who he is and what his background is, and all the pieces just kind of like, okay, this makes sense. This is why he was talking the way he was. This is why he used the specific terms that he used.
All right.
because he had some training, and those were terms that he had used frequently.
It was apparent also in Louetta's case that the suspect had been in the house a little while prior to her arriving home. And like Shaun said in our case also, that it appeared that he had already prepared the cords and stuff to tie up Louetta, and that had been done prior to her coming home. And also the bath. He also did have Louetta take a bath. And for us, that was always, you know, a concern of why would he do that? Like you just mentioned, that DNA really wasn't that well known at the time. But of course, with his background, he may have been thinking that. And it was also, these were the MOs, besides the DNA matching, but the MOs of what he was doing in these cases that, you know, made us believe that they were related.
That was another thing, is he also duct taped Jerry's eyes and put a bag over her head. So it was a very similar MO. He had an identical MO in the fact that he bound their eyes or covered their eyes and put a bag over their head.
So this guy's, it's obvious that he's not a novice at this by the way that he perpetuated these crimes, but it was because of the Sac PD case that the rape kit from the victim was sent to the crime lab, right, Shaun?
Yes, both the kit was sent there, and I believe Pete Willover had some amazing forethought and insight into both. He put together, I believe he pretty quickly put together that they had a similar MO.
Right.
And I believe that's when the cases kind of appeared to have merged. Like, okay, we know we have a similar suspect because of the MO basis.
Right. So for the listeners, when you mentioned Pete Willover, he's probably one of, at least my kind of ideal detectives from Sac PD. He's retired now, but he was one of the major sexual assault detectives in the history of Sacramento Police Department. But the DNA ultimately, Louetta's case, the 1992 case, and the 1994 case of Jerry were linked by DNA. And then at some point, and maybe Micki, you can, at some point, we then linked those two cases to a case out of Davis, California, right?
Yes. So in Davis, I believe it was January 11th, 1994, a young lady named Kristen, who actually attended the University of Davis and lived in the area, was out jogging. Now, keep in mind that it's interesting because she was 22 years old, and this case actually doesn't fall within the same MO as the SPD case in our case. Those women were a little older. It occurred in their homes. He broke in and raped them in their homes. This one, Kristen's 22 years old. It was about 9:45, 9:50 at night. She went out for a jog. Of course, it's dark then, it's January, but she was comfortable in the area. I mean, Davis, you know, it's a university town, low crime rate, certainly at that time. She was jogging by an area with construction where they were building new, I think, apartment buildings or something. She saw a man go by her. She kind of looked at him and then didn't feel threatened at all, kept jogging. As she got around to one of the other buildings and turned a corner, that same man was standing there. He confronted her right away. She said she thought he used a stun gun to get control of her. He knocked her to the ground. He repeatedly hit her in the head. She was fighting at first because she was young and just knew that she had to get away from him. He eventually tried to rape her. And the big thing for this victim, since she was so young, is that she was a virgin and she didn't want to have sex until she got married. So this was even more tragic for her, that this is how this was going to happen. He threatened to cut her throat. He was very violent with her, hit her many times. And eventually he he threatened her, said he was going to kill her. She actually tried to talk him out of raping her because she was a virgin. And she said, oddly enough, that he kind of like wanted to listen to that. Like he had some empathy for that, which she thought was so weird because he was so violent with her. He had a mask on, and he did rape her. Well, he tried to rape her, and eventually she was able to talk him down, and she was able to get away. She didn't really get a good look at him, but she did know it was a white male suspect.
If I could add to that is while she was talking to him, she gave us he made her look into his eyes, and she was afraid to do that because she didn't want to know who he was for identification, because he was threatening to kill her. And he specifically basically threatened to hurt her if she didn't look at him. And that's when she remembered these distinct blue eyes. They're kind of like a greenish blue. And so he also he used some sick psychology in the fact that he told her, "You never know who I am. I might be the person in the grocery store. I might be at your school." He made some pretty sick comments to her to instill fear for the rest of her life.
Right.
And so prior to him leaving, and I truly believe that Kristen talked him down. She has the gift of gab, and she was able to kind of get him calm down and rationalize who she was, and that she was a person, and that she was also trying to live morally. And I think that played to some of his upbringing, and I think that played to he was raised in a pretty strict religious household. And so I think her talking about her religion and trying to live morally played to his upbringing. And I think he made a connection, and that ultimately led to him letting her go and not continuing to assault her.
Interesting. Obviously not known at the time, but once you identified him. So let me just kind of fast forward a little bit to 2000, because we know that these cases are linked by DNA. For the listeners and others, the statute of limitations at this time, meaning like how long do you have to charge somebody with a crime, at the time of these crimes was 6 years. So we're now getting to 2000, the March 1994 case, a SAC PD case. The statute of limitation was going to run. And to go back to Pete Willover, the SAC PD detective that was assigned to these, Pete called me up in December of 99. He had a couple cases, Micki, this carry over the same. It's the serial rapist cases. We have the second story rapist running around Sacramento. We have this rapist running around Sacramento. And really, Pete kind of asked, is there anything to do on these cases? Because the statute's about to run. And coincidentally, I had read a story in the paper about a prosecutor in Wisconsin with this idea about maybe we can charge their DNA since we don't know who they are. And ultimately, not going into too much into the weeds, what we did in Sacramento was we filed the first ever, what we call a John Doe DNA warrant. This actually was the first case. We then followed that up with the second story rapist case, but we filed this case 2 days, if my memory's right, before, maybe 3, before the statute would have run, meaning that had we not done this, the kind of new and novel little tool, this person would have really potentially gotten away with these crimes. So that was filed in, I think, March 21st of 2000. That allowed us to comply with what we call that statute of limitations deadline. We did charge Luetta's case, and we charged that with the torture, and Amy can talk about that later, but torture is kind of a different statute of limitations thing. So that allowed us to preserve this case and move it forward. That this kind of new idea ultimately went all the way to the California Supreme Court, and they decided that it was a lawful way to charge somebody, which, I think we're all pretty proud of, that we're able to do this now if we need to. So to be clear, so we have the warrant out there. We issue a warrant, a complaint charging People versus John Doe. We put his DNA in the warrant and in the complaint. So that's just kind of out there. And before we get to this kind of idea about genealogy, and I'll kind of get to Amy on that one, but maybe Micki and Shaun, like over the years. So we've got this warrant out there. These crimes happened 92 and 94. What would you say was kind of being done by law enforcement? You have DNA, you just can't put the face to it yet.
Yeah, I'll go first if you don't mind, Shaun. I think the best part, honestly, I mean, if it weren't for Pete, for having the tenacity to always not let things go away and not give up, and then the idea of how to preserve the statute of limitations really kept these cases living, I think. But over the years, they were worked, on and off. We would get tips sometimes, just getting lists of people, who were the sex offenders at that time. Can we find out where they were they in custody? Just trying to eliminate people or include them in a possible suspect list. I will say, though, I think especially when you have cases that are series related like this, that whoever's working them doesn't want to let them go and doesn't want, whether we can charge it or not, which obviously is our goal, is that we figure out who this person was that assaulted these women. So we did work it for a lot of years, following up on tips. In fact, Kristen, one of the victims, prior to us doing the genealogy on this case, called. Shaun had mentioned that she remembered the eyes. There was a person that was arrested on a murder, and she saw his picture a few years back, and the eyes looked similar, and she called to say, hey, can you guys look into this guy, because his eyes look like the suspect. We were able, obviously, to eliminate him, but those are the things that we were following up on as much as we could.
Yeah, I know. The SAC PD, we had our case was in a continual evaluation, and we had our cold case detectives. They would biannually or annually review the case to see if there's any new tips or if any new information. But it was really limited, and it was just kind of hinging on the DNA. We had good DNA, but it wasn't every year. It was getting run in CODIS, but nothing was hitting. And so it was kind of just evaluating, okay, we made sure our CODIS check was done this year. Okay, nothing was new, no new tips. And so, but it was never dropped. It was never just set in a corner and gained dust. It always was being picked up and evaluated. And when I initially got the case, I read through update after update after update of detectives trying to get a new lead in this case, and there wasn't.
Right.
So
right. So we get to 2018, and this kind of famous case out there resulted in an arrest. A guy called the Golden State Killer here in Sacramento East Area rapist. And I'm going to kind of bring Amy into this now, because Amy, you were one of the lead prosecutors on the Golden State Killer case. And I know from that time till now, you've now become kind of an expert on genetic genealogy and the value of that new tool. So maybe kind of just give the listeners like a sense of what you've learned through the Golden State Killer case and these other cases that we're now being able to use this tool on.
Sure. Well, D'Angelo was arrested in April of 2018. That was the first time that genetic genealogy was used to solve a case. And then it just seemed like an avalanche started after that. Lots of different cases getting solved across the country. And then in Sacramento, this series of cases that these detectives have described today. I think it was towards December of 2018. So just 6 or 7 months after D'Angelo was arrested, Detective McGovern was working with our team at the DA's office to try to solve this case. And I think it took a little while to solve it. But I think then it took even longer to find him in this particular scenario. So, but meanwhile, there were just a lot happening. It was very exciting. These new techniques being used to solve these cases that had been cold for 20, 30, 40 years. So it was a very exciting time.
Very exciting, that's for sure. And will continue to be exciting. So one of the things mentioned, Amy, is you mentioned CODIS. Just for the listeners, when we talk about DNA cases, CODIS stands for Convicted Offender DNA Index System. Basically, people that are convicted of crimes or people that are arrested for felonies have to give their DNA. And that's how we're able, ultimately, when you run the DNA, you look to see if it matches anybody. And over the years, obviously on this case, it didn't match anybody. Same thing with D'Angelo. We didn't have any matches to any convicted offenders. So that's why, this new tool became so critical. Let me go back to your comment about, this particular case. And you mentioned Shaun and Micki and Shaun. Had you guys ever actually done genealogy cases before this case, or what was your experience or knowledge that you had leading up to this particular case?
We had actually just come off of the NorCal rapist case. So I had assisted our detectives in the NorCal, and so we had some familiarity with that. And so I understood the process, but we watched D'Angelo get taken down, and then we assisted on getting Roy Waller, and then this case popped up. So we were pretty excited, or I was pretty excited to be able to get involved and to try genealogy. So it's pretty exciting.
Right. Micki, how about you?
Yeah, up to this point, I had not. This was the first case that I actually got involved in the genealogy. And it was so different because I had done my own genealogy and worked on my own heritage, but it was not anything like what this is.
Okay. So maybe if one of you can kind of walk through, and I don't want to go into the specifics of this particular genealogy, but just the general, and maybe Amy, if you don't mind, or Shaun, any one of you, just kind of give us, the listeners, an overview of how does this work?
I can speak to that if that's okay. Basically the DNA sample, or for the suspect sample, is submitted, and we get a full genome, and basically we get all the DNA cursors for the entire. Normally CODIS is only, I believe, 18 points or 13 points.
25, I think.
Yeah,
now.
25 now.
Oh, right.
It keeps getting more and more, and but this is a full genome, and so it's sent off, and we get 3 large files of data, which is then sent and condensed to where it can be inputted into a genealogy site. And so in this case, Manteuffel's genealogy was inputted into the site, which allows us to see the closest relative match, and that's measured on what they call a centimorgan, which is the higher the number of centimorgans, the closer you are to a relative match.
And for the listeners, and you guys correct me, Amy, Shaun, we're talking about 700,000 to 1 million points of comparison. Correct. Versus what we have in forensic world, which is about 25, which is still very, very, very helpful. But that's the power of using genealogy, is the number of points of comparison, right?
Right.
Correct.
It's much more magnified look at someone's DNA.
Okay. So just kind of in general, one of you upload a bad guy's DNA to a genealogy site, you get information back, and that's when you start building family trees, correct?
Correct.
Yes.
Okay, so just to kind of get to this point, at some point after you all were working on this case, building family trees, someone becomes what I would call a person of interest, that maybe this is the guy, right?
Yes. In February of 2019 was the first time that a particular suspect was identified.
Okay.
Through the use of genetic genealogy.
And who wants to reveal the big reveal here? What was the name? Shaun, how about you?
Well, I remember getting the phone call from Kirk. I was actually following up and we were on a drive from San Francisco, and I got the call from Kirk that, hey, Monica found a link. We have a common name. At this point, Kirk
Hold
and
on a
Monica.
second. Why don't you tell the listeners who Kirk and Monica are?
So Kirk Campbell and Monica Chakowski with the Sacramento District Attorney's Office. They are amazing. The two of them have done phenomenal work, and they were kind of the lead in the genealogy building of the trees, and kind of give guidance to me as to, I was working on one tree, they were working on another tree, which we ended up, we had maternal and paternal trees with over 1,200 names at the end. And so Kirk called me and said, hey, we've got a common name. And I knew what that meant. That meant that our trees had matched at some point, and that led to Mark Manteuffels' parents.
Okay.
And so from that point on, we had a name and we had an idea of who our suspect was.
Micki, at what point were you brought into this? Were you already involved in this part, or you then got involved later once the name came out?
No, I did start right away with on the first couple of meetings where we started the genealogy work. I think we all kind of worked separate a little bit, and there was get-together meetings. But I did keep, Shaun and I didn't work that much close together after those first few meetings, but I did work with Kirk and Monica. Yeah, it was just so exciting to actually have somebody that you can look at and say, well, let's either eliminate them or confirm they're our suspect, which is, that's our goal.
Right.
So that was so exciting to be part of that for the first time, because now I've done so many of them, but I'll always remember this was the first one that I got to be part of.
So let me ask this. So once this kind of name comes out there, Mark Manteuffel, what do you think was the most significant piece of information you learned about him at the time when you got his name? I assume you start doing research on the guy, right?
Right. And a great tool for us in investigation is just to Google the name, put the name into and see what's out there and see what pops up. And we had his driver's license. We were able to figure out his age and everything, so we knew what he looked like. And one of the first things that I did was enter his name in the internet, and it popped up with the Bureau of Prisons and showed him to be an assistant warden in Miami, Florida. And that was pretty shocking.
Yeah, that's kind of like the whole Angelo big reveal when we found out he was a police officer. And for me, when that happened, that was kind of like an aha moment. So, so kind of walk us through. I mean, the thing that I think I've learned about this after listening to you all and looking at the investigation is this is a guy that spent almost 3 decades trying to elude capture. And I think it would be interesting for the listeners to understand, once you started to really do a deep dive, Amy, you were very involved in this at this point because you knew what was going on and you knew that this was the person of interest. But I guess the first step is you got to make sure he's not just the guy in the tree, right? You got to make sure he's actually the guy. So what did that entail? How did you confirm he's the guy?
Well, we were able to locate a potential relative, and Shaun and his team went and collected a surreptitious sample, an abandoned, sample of DNA from this person we believe to be a relative. They brought that sample to the crime lab. They were able to do the traditional STR DNA testing and confirm that we were on the right track, that this person was a relative of Mark Manteuffel.
And that DNA was the same as the person. Well, the relative had the same DNA of the person that you're interested in as being the serial rapist, right?
Correct. That's correct. And then by doing that testing, we were able to confirm we were on the right track. And then ultimately that led, directly to Mark Manteuffel. But the problem was that we could not find Mark Manteuffel for some period of time. And I'll let Shaun talk about that. He was directly involved with that.
Yeah, when we first started running his information, and we used some open source data sources, and it was PO box after PO box after PO box, and it kind of bounced down to Southern California, and it went over to Oklahoma, and it was all PO boxes. And when I ran the records for the PO boxes, it came back to trailer parks, it came back to hotels. So he wasn't listing his true address or where he was living at, and it kind of bounced down to Florida, which was consistent with seeing him being the photo of the Bureau of Prisons. And so we started running in, we tried to find any phone numbers, any kind of associations, and it was blank. There was nothing there other than the PO boxes. And then one of my coworkers in Detective Massingale, he started working registration. He had a prior registration for a vehicle out of Oklahoma, and he did some digging and found out that it was sold to kind of like a scrap company. And so he made just that phone call to the scrap company. And interestingly enough, the lady on the other end of the phone remembered the interaction with Manteuffel because it was so strange. He basically called this company and said, "I want to sell you my vehicle, but I'm in Atlanta, Georgia." And they're like, "That's 8 hours
Odd.
away."
Yeah, that's odd.
It was really odd. And so he's like, "Well, I want to sell it there." And his vehicle was registered out of Oklahoma. So the lady's like, "Okay, well, we'll send a tow truck out there, but it's going to be 8 hours to get there." And the lady said he sold the car really cheaply. And so that's what stuck out in her memory. And interestingly enough, the company scans all the records. So every time they do an interaction, they scan all the records. And part of this transaction, he actually had to show up to sign papers. So they sent a tow truck 8 hours away to Atlanta, Georgia, picked up the vehicle, and then 3 days later, he showed up at the scrapyard and signed over the vehicle to the lady. And interestingly enough, the pickup address was Mark's girlfriend's house, currently that was in Atlanta. And throughout these interactions, he had given the scrapyard his cell phone number. So there we had a direct link to trying to figure out where he was at. And ultimately what happened was we pulled those records, and he had shut that phone off after selling the car. So then we had to do some digging and figure out who he had called, and then from there kind of figure out the new number, and we were able to do that.
So let me ask this, and I mean, it sounds to me, and first of all, this is a dude that's living off the grid, basically everything he can to live off the grid, right? So do you think, one of the three of you, do you think that the arrest of the Golden State Killer in April of 2018 played any role in his mind in terms of, or do you think he was just a guy that, was smart and just trying to avoid capture? But do you think that the arrest of D'Angelo had anything to do with his living off the grid?
I have to say, I think that he's always been like this. I think when he did the assaults that we eventually identified him for, having some law enforcement experience, being a criminal justice major at school, gave him some ideas. I mean, I think that's how he eluded capture in the 90s. Right. Mask, trying to, cover his face, his hand, not leave prints. Even washing down the victims at this time that, most people would never have thought of doing that. So I think, the Golden State Killer case probably heightened his awareness and probably made him think that eventually they're going to get me. But I think he knew this all along, that he was just smart enough to elude capture and identification because he took precautions to do that.
Shaun, Amy, you guys were working hand in hand on warrants and things like that to kind of just lead the listeners through like the capture of this serial rapist.
So we ended up working with the FBI because we were dealing with a suspect that was out of our state.
Right.
And in Atlanta. We had him tracked down to an address in Decatur, Georgia. And so ultimately we worked with the FBI, and they put on a surveillance team on him and monitored him, and they were ultimately able to get a surreptitious sample from him. And I remember getting that phone call. The FBI guys were extremely excited because they sat on him. He was pretty reclusive. He didn't leave that often. He'd only really kind of go to the convenience store and go back to the home. And even the neighbors later on, they said, hey, we really never saw him. We saw him rarely. So to get that surreptitious sample was pretty big for the FBI. And then that was sent to Sacramento and processed by the Sacramento County Crime Lab, and ultimately came up with a direct match. And so from there, we worked on getting an arrest warrant. We ultimately coordinated with the FBI to go in June, the last part of June, and we had scheduled with them to do an arrest at the girlfriend's house. They had continual surveillance on him and knew that he was there. And so that's when the two teams, the sheriff department team and the Sac PD team, flew over with Amy Holliday, and we ultimately worked on getting him arrested with the assistance of the FBI.
So, I mean, from a legal point of view, did you have to work with the Georgia authorities in terms of warrants and all those kinds of things?
We did.
Definitely. And we really appreciated Amy being with us, because ultimately we had a lot of court that we had to do with Georgia, and having Amy there. And I think Amy can speak to the whole process with working with the Georgia court.
It was a really interesting process. We were on a red-eye flight to meet up with Shaun's team and the FBI, hoping to be there in time for the arrest. And we were on our flight, and unfortunately somebody had a medical emergency on our flight. So we had an emergency landing in Memphis, which delayed us. And I felt bad for the person, but at the same time, really wanted to get to Atlanta to be there in time for the arrest. We barely made it. I flew, dressed for court, because I knew we were going to have to hit the ground running. I met Shaun at the DA's office there in DeKalb County, Georgia. And really, ultimately, our warrants had to be reworked to comply with what was required in Atlanta. So Shaun and I did that together with the DA there and their chief investigator, and they got us in front of a judge just a couple hours later. And keep in mind, this was a judge that knew nothing about this case and nothing about investigative genetic genealogy. And it really, I think it's fair to say, Shaun, that it blew his mind. And he had a lot of questions about, what we were doing and how we did it, and ultimately signed the warrants. And Manteuffel was taken into custody by then, and then he was interviewed.
And you had the sheriff's office was with you, right? You had detectives. Was it Michelle Hendricks from the Sac Sheriff's Office went along with you as well?
Yes, we had Michelle Hendricks and Amber Lawrence from the Sheriff's Department, along with Shaun and his team from Sacramento Police Department. So it was quite something. It was really a group effort to get it done. And also Garrett Hamilton from Yolo County DA's office was instrumental as well, helping get us a warrant for the Davis case and get that set at no bail, so that we could ensure that Manteuffel was going to be held in Atlanta until the extradition proceedings.
So you mentioned just kind of a little bit in passing that, getting a statement from him, and just Shaun, I assume you were involved in that. Just tell us kind of what, did he talk? Did he say anything? Did he admit it?
Well, ultimately he was willing to talk to us, but he wasn't willing to discuss his involvement. He pretty much denied, but he was pretty quiet throughout the whole thing. He really played out wanting to know what we had on him. And when we presented him the DNA evidence, I think that was kind of the nail in the coffin for him. He was kind of, it seemed like he was playing it through his mind, and I presented him a lab report that showed that he matched the suspect, and he was in fact the suspect. And once Michelle and I exited the interview room, he put his head on the table. He looked at the report, and then he just put his head on the table over the report and was like that for about 20 minutes.
Yeah, the gig is up, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I think
before you guys did the interview, did you know much about his personality? I mean, Micki, you made a reference to him going to Sac State. I mean, had you done a deep dive like before the interview to like, what's this guy like? What's he all about? I mean, what did you know about him walking into that room?
well, prior to we had some information regarding some prior law enforcement experience at a Roden Park. We knew that he worked for the Bureau of Prisons. I knew that he had at least a master's at Sac State in criminology, and so, or sorry, criminal justice. And so I knew that he had knowledge of law enforcement. I knew he had knowledge of the criminal justice system. So going into it, I was actually kind of surprised that he didn't immediately invoke. But then again, I think he was kind of playing the chess game in his mind to find out which incident we were talking about,
Right.
because I don't think he knew what he was being arrested for, and I don't think it stopped at just these 3 incidents. So I think he was kind of playing the game, but to figure out which victims we were talking about. Once we kind of disclosed the what crimes we were arresting him for, he just ultimately shut down. So
Now you guys mentioned when the arrest was done, was there anything that you found in his possession that kind of supported this whole thing that he was always going to try to elude capture?
yes, during the search of his residence, he had kind of a room that had his closet. He lived pretty minimally. He didn't have a lot of belongings inside of his girlfriend's apartment. And there was what we call a go bag, a bag that you can just grab and go. And it had a passport. It had about $10,000. It had other identifications that he had, and like a change of clothes. It was just like he could grab this bag at any moment, get in a car, and go. So it definitely looked like he was prepared to take off at any moment. And so he also had in his wallet a checklist of any time he did anything out in the world. He basically, it said like, don't use your social security number. He had no email, no don't use use PO box. Like, he had this checklist of what anytime he was involved with something outside of his house, he would make sure that he was trying to stay off the grid.
Well, thank goodness for genetic genealogy, because that go bag was never deployed. So let me get to, you mentioned, Shaun, and I don't know if this was before the capture, that he had this master's degree in criminal justice. Was there anything about it that you learned about him that kind of solidified that this is a serial rapist type of guy?
Yeah, definitely. I was contacted shortly after his arrest, and his name was put out there. Our phone started ringing about people who had contact with him, and one of him was a mentor professor who guided him through his master's degree. And when I talked to him about what his thesis was for his master's, it was on victimology and a victim's response to trauma. I tried to find that paper, and it was interesting. He alluded to that in some of his jail calls regarding, go to Sacramento State, go get my, find my paper, to other family members. And so I was never able to find that actual thesis, but based on the conversation that I had with one of his mentor professors, it seemed like he had kind of focused his paperwork on victimology and the victim's response, which was kind of weird given the fact of he was assaulting these ladies.
So he's obviously brought back, Amy, right? Brought back from Georgia.
Yes, he agreed when presented with the choice of coming back, with us on a 5-hour flight. or taking a 60-day bus ride across the country, he elected to waive his rights and be extradited back to Sacramento.
Okay, so kind of walk us through, you're the lead prosecutor on this case now. Kind of just walk us through how it got to the point he ultimately pled guilty, right?
Yes, he did.
Kind of just explain that process.
So he's returned to Sacramento and he's arraigned just a couple of days after we get back. And one of the really neat things about the arraignment is not only were the victims there, but we had, the former detectives, the retired people. Micki was there, Donna Simmons, Pete Willover, Shaun, and so we had the original detectives, the new detectives, the victims, their families. It was really a special time for them to, come together and see him for the first time and know who he was. So we went through the, kind of the normal prosecution process. We're getting ready for preliminary hearing. We had met with the victims, and I knew when I met Jerry, I knew that she was, more fragile. She's a little bit older, and I knew that there was some health concerns. And as we went on with the process, we got to November of 2018, and Jerry
19.
Contacted Shaun
20?
and I.
20?
I'm sorry. No, it would have been November of 2019. So let me start over. So in November of 2019, Jerry contacted Shaun and I and our victim advocate, Maylin, and let us know that she was having some serious health problems. And so the decision was made to do what we call a conditional examination. And that's where you, you apply to the court, make a motion, indicate what the problems are. And there is a code section that allows you to examine the victim or witness as if you were in court. So the defense is there, the defendant is there. We video it, we audio record it as well so that we can preserve it for future use if the person is not alive at the time of trial. And we knew that her health, it was serious. So we did the conditional exam. It took 3 days to do it because we had to do it in half days. She was, had trouble breathing, had trouble getting through it. She was so strong. It was incredible. And she remembered everything like it was yesterday. And she did a fantastic job. And the defendant saw all of that. And, and I think that it made great strides towards ultimately resolving the case. And unfortunately, that was in November of 2019. Jerry passed away in February of 2020. So just 3 months after the conditional examination.
Very sad. Very sad. So at what point then was the plea? What happened?
The matter went forward, and eventually the defense and I were in touch, and eventually they approached me and said he's interested in resolving the case short of trial. And I think again that conditional exam had a lot to do with that after seeing her and hearing her testify. So ultimately in October of 2020, he pled guilty to the sexual assaults and sodomy as well, involving the 2 incidents with Jerry and Louetta, and was sentenced. Louetta was there. She made a fantastic victim impact statement, and Jerry was represented by her niece and her best friend, and some other friends as well. So it was just a really powerful moment for these ladies. And then we went on to Yolo County. He pled guilty in Yolo County as well for the sexual assault of Kristen. And we have all attended the judgment and sentencing there as well in December of 2020.
What was his sentence?
Ultimately, he was sentenced to 29 years in state prison, and his maximum exposure had been 35 years. So it was close to the maximum exposure, but very different than what would have been available as sentencing guidelines had that happened currently. And that really was frustrating for me, that someone was going to get 29 years for these 3 horrific, violent sexual assaults of these ladies. That was probably the hardest part for me to wrap my head around, because it just, after doing so many sexual assault prosecutions and seeing people, face very serious consequences as they should, that just didn't sit right with me. And it's still a struggle to this day for me to wrap my head around that.
Well, for the listeners, the law changed in November of 94. So this, Jerry's crime happened in March of 94. And in November 94, the voters, I believe the legislature passed a law called one strike. So now we have these greater tools, right? He would have gotten life.
Right. And he would have, he had all these different aggravating factors, lying in wait, tying them up, threatening them with a knife. All these different factors would have resulted in a sentence in the, hundreds of years instead of a couple of decades.
Right. So Micki, I'm going to go to you. So I assume you were at the pleas and the sentencings and all of that. Just kind of walk us through your feelings at the time.
Well, it was amazing to be part of this. Obviously, I wasn't involved in the initial investigation of these crimes, but when I did become involved and just knowing Louetta, I never met Jerry, but I worked with Louetta quite a bit and with Kristen, the other victim in Davis. And as Amy said, Louetta did a great job at her victim impact statement during that hearing. And these women, I just can't believe the courage, the resiliency, and the strength to survive this event and then live all these years with it, not knowing, if this man would ever be caught. Louetta, it's kind of it just shows her strength is she still lives in the same house that this occurred in. And a lot of women would have moved out of there because of the thoughts of what happened in that hallway when you first come home, putting the alarm system on. Obviously, it didn't work in this case, all those things. But Louetta told me, I'm not going to move. This man controlled me for several hours, and it was horrible, but I wasn't going to let him control the rest of my life. And so she said, I love my house. I'm staying here. This is my neighborhood. And just listening to this person talk like this after they've been through so much, she's just an amazing woman and so strong. And so is Kristen, just moving on with their life and going forward, but never forgetting, obviously.
I remember both women, Anne Marie, telling me, because they both lived in the same home. And I remember both of them telling me that, I bought this house with my own money and it's mine and he's not going to take that from me. And that was really stood out for me. Just amazing.
Shaun, you mentioned that one of the things that he said to Jerry during the assault was, I think, something to the effect of, I might be the guy standing in line at the grocery store. And I think it's interesting. And I wonder if that's, it's obviously a fear tactic, but then you see this person then go on to write a master's degree on victimology. And you wonder if that was part of his plan, was just to instill this fear because he understood the trauma that he was inflicting on these women.
Definitely. I think he had some psychological insight and he knew exactly what he was saying to these victims when he made these comments, and especially just prior to leaving, he made comments that I'm pretty sure he knew was going to instill fear in their lives for the rest of their lives. Just the kind of the stalking nature. I know where you live. I live down the street. I could be the guy at the grocery store, and that did. And some of the victims, they did have issues with, seeing, specifically one victim saw a man wink at her at a grocery store and they dropped the milk that they were holding because it just instilled instant fear in them. Because could that be the guy?
Right.
So it was just sick in nature for sure. So
how did you feel when you were there at the sentencing? Having been engaged in this and coming together and all that.
It was pretty powerful. To see the victims and the response to seeing him being sentenced, to seeing him cowering there at his table. It was pretty powerful. And I was just super honored to be a part of the investigation and to be a part of seeking justice and getting this person behind bars.
All right. So I just want to kind of wrap it up here since we're kind of about our limit here, but just ask you, I'll start with you, Amy, like, what's your takeaway on this case?
My takeaway is that the power of an investigative genetic genealogy is solving these cases that, we never thought we would solve, and getting justice for victims that had some of them have given up hope.
Mhm.
And so being able to seek justice and find justice for these victims of crime is so powerful. And I'm just so thankful how this case came together, the timing of it all, for Jerry and her family, and was just really proud to be a part of this amazing team.
Excellent. Shaun, how about you?
My takeaway was just the power of having the support from the DA's office and coming together between all the agencies to work together to put this investigation together. I think everybody had a key part in it, and just working together as a team. It's just amazing to see. And with the FBI, we had phenomenal investigators with the FBI that assisted us, and everybody when involved was truly dedicated to getting this resolved and getting justice for these victims. So my biggest takeaway is just the power of coming together and working for a joint cause was pretty powerful.
Yeah, I call that oftentimes team justice. So you
Right.
all got to be part of team justice. So Micki, what about you? What's your final takeaway on this one?
Well, there's just a couple of things. One thing I wanted to say is I think as investigators, we were always led to believe the information out there was serial rapists, serial murderers can't stop. Taught to believe that serial rapists and serial murderers never stop doing their crimes. How can they control themselves? They can't. And I think now we know that in the East Area Rapist case, in this rape series, I think we believe that, yeah, at some point they did stop doing their crimes. That's a real key for me, because I always believed that they couldn't control that. And the other thing was just never giving up, never quitting. We're not going to solve every case that we work and investigate, but I think that we give hope to families, victims and their families when we continue to work as hard as we do on these. I have a sign in my office that says 365 new days, 365 new chances. And that's how I look at the cases. And I think every day we have a chance to solve one. That's what I feel like when we work together as a team like this. It's amazing.
Yeah. I think for me that it's just another example of the power of passion and persistence, by law enforcement, by using these tools. The power of investigative genetic genealogy is changing the world. So I want to thank all of you, Micki, Shaun, Amy, for this incredible work you did on this case. To the listeners out there, thank you for listening. To hear more episodes like this one, please visit InsideCrimeFiles.com. And thank you for listening. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I am Anne Marie Schubert, and this is Inside the Crime Files.